Hello everybody, I'm Gwen Campbell-Mindes. Welcome to Gwen's Bookish Ramblings. So last week we talked about the first book in this trilogy. This week we are obviously doing the second book in the trilogy. And at the end of the last book, Buffy, Riley, and Angel were about to be shot by cops. Because they are cops that are working with the Russian mafia, because apparently they weren't smart enough to realize that working with the Russian mafia of all things might not be the greatest idea in the world. It's one thing if you're a dirty cop who's going to shake people down on your own. I really think it's another thing to work with an organization that's that big, because really you're asking for trouble in a way that I don't think is usually worth it. But then again, what do I know? So this book actually does not pick up the minute where the last book left off, because the last book having ended on very specifically a cliffhanger, Buffy and Riley having traveled to LA to find a guy who is a member of a particular gang in Sunnydale, because they were reasonably certain that this gang member had been that the gang that the Sunnydale gang, Nikki de la Natividad, who is a missing person they are searching for. Well, sort of missing. His sister's worried he was dumb enough to join a gang. The De La Natividad family are very, very wealthy. So he's doing the poor little rich boy thing of deciding that he needs to have a family that's like his real family. And so he joined a Mexican gang, which is just, okay, great. That's, you know, anyways, so they're looking for him. They've tracked down a member of the Echo Park gang, because they know Nikki had headed out to Echo Park and the Echo Park gang in LA. Angel, in the meantime, is tracking this guy down because he's doing an investigation that started with a Mexican man who was wrongly accused of murdering a Russian mafioso, or whatever they call them in Russian mafia. I don't know. Um, and so they all show up at the same time, at which point that guy takes off running and runs straight through a portal into an alternate reality. Not that they know, they just know these golden doorway things are showing up and people are wandering through them, or occasionally just disappearing through them, period. But a bunch of police officers show up at the same time and are planning on killing Angel because he threatened one of their own for, exposing him as a dirty cop. And Riley and Buffy are basically just there. Anyway, but this book actually opens with a prologue set in a fast food burger joint called Cowtown Burger. And effectively it's a very brief bit by this guy who is working at Cowtown Burger, and one night on the graveyard shift, the other two people on his shift both vanish into thin air, leaving him alone, and he eventually has a complete nervous breakdown, and the cops get called, and that's the end of that. Anyways, so throughout this book, we start getting flashbacks to Russia, or rather to the USSR. They are flashbacks from the perspective of a young scientist who is eagerly working for a super fancy, super sci-fi project under the administration of the USSR, and he's a hardcore communist. Like, he's one of those people who deeply, deeply believes in the communist regime and the Communist Party and the freedoms of communism and all that kind of stuff. And basically, he's one of those people who was effectively spoiled by the communist system, because he didn't ever have to be on the wrong end of it. He wasn't one of those people who starved to death during World War II because the communist regime didn't care enough to actually take care of people in St. Petersburg when they were, under threat by Nazis. He wasn't one of those people who got sent to Siberia, to a gulag. He wasn't one of those people who was put into a horrible, horrible situation, who couldn't get enough food, who couldn't do whatever. He was one of those people who got to live the dream because of communism. And so he's one of those people who never quite understood the problems of communism. But, anyways, so he's a very hardcore communist, and his story as it develops is that they work very, very hard on this project to open gateways into alternate realities. Because you can think of all kinds of military applications, going into an alternate reality and stealing technology, going into an alternate reality and letting loose monsters on, your enemies, finding allies in alternate realities. There's all kinds of possibilities. So, they're working on it and they're developing this technology, and then the USSR falls. And then there is no more United Soviet Socialist Republics. There's just Russia and a bunch of satellite nations that are going to try to have to find their way with their entire administration having fallen apart out from under them. And he and his wife collect their daughter and collect the technology and go on the run to try to effectively take this technology and someday rebuild the USSR. And they do that thing, that keynote mistake that you see so often in fiction and probably sometimes in real life, and that is the keynote mistake of raising your child in such a way that, in this case, Alina is very, very much aware of how circumscribed her life is. And her life is so circumscribed that one of her greatest dreams is to go see the Grand Canyon. She just wants to go see the Grand Canyon, and her parents are so obsessed with reconstituting the USSR, so obsessed with their work, and her father, because she's psychic. The whole family, both parents and her, are psychic because you need a psychic. You need somebody with psychic powers to, sort of punch the machine over the last little hump to making it possible to crack open alternate universe stuff. They're so obsessed with this that they keep her in a bare, empty room that has no toys and nothing fun in it and no joy and nothing. And they don't let her. She says that they taught her science and English and Russian. And it's not like there aren't large amounts of Russian literature out there. Like, they're so obsessed that there must have been communist fiction written. Russia and that whole region was communist for decades and decades and decades. There must have been pro-communist fiction, but apparently she doesn't have access to novels, and you'd think there'd be novels, but there aren't. You'd think that they'd give her, I don't know, Cuban novels, because Cuba's had been communist, is still communist. I suppose things are relative as various Western capitalist enterprises make their way into things. You'd think that Chinese novels and Cuban novels and old communist novels from other things would be part of the education, but it's sort of like she's leading this joyless existence that has nothing in it but the work. And it's a kind of a mistake because you know, it's one of those, it's a judicious choice that my mother made. When they told her that she wouldn't be able to safely swallow food anymore, she made the decision to keep on eating because what's the point in living for 1,000 years if you're going to be miserable the whole time? It's all very well and good to say you'll make it to 100, but if you make it to 100 being sad every day of your life, you haven't really gotten all that much great out of it. And what they've done with their daughter is they've pushed her and pushed her and pushed her, given her no other options, and given her no chance to see anything else. When she asks them as a child, well, can't I have some toys? Can't I have some color in my bedroom? And they take away the TV instead. And it's abnormal, and it's abnormal in a lot of ways that they don't realize. One suspects partly because they're both so obsessed with reconstituting the USSR that they forget that their lives had greater meaning and more things and more people, and they had each other. Because her parents met and fell in love, and all she has is them and her room and the work, and it's not work that she loves for its own sake. And when they start making her kidnap teenagers and shove them through a portal into an alternate universe in order to effectively blackmail the US government into paying them enough money to restart the USSR, it's a step too far, and she takes the machine and goes on the lam. And that's a story that runs through this book, interspersed with the story of Buffy trying to deal with the invasion in Sunnydale, and Angel trying to deal with dirty cops and figuring out where all of these people are going missing and what's going on with the Russian mafia. And at the end of this book, we leave off on another cliffhanger of Buffy and Angel, who are both about to step through, well, who do step through, but it's kind of a, and she stepped through, dun dun dun. Uh, they're stepping through into an alternate universe to try to find the missing teenagers, the missing young people who have been taken. And all of these stories are dovetailing together. They are also, I discovered because it has been a very long time since I read this book, part of a continuity Nancy Holder had started putting together before this book, because this is a 2001 publication. And Nancy Holder in 1999 had published a book, had published a Buffy tie-in novel, which I think it might have even been a trilogy, which involved somebody called the Gatekeeper, who is, as you may have guessed, somebody who guards various gates and pathways of the dead. It's very Lord of the Ringsy, I suspect, in ways. That whole thing where there's somebody who guards the gateway and you can walk along the path of the dead where the dead live and stuff. It's also been a very long time since I read those. It rings a bell because I'm pretty sure I did read them. I might even own a copy. But I have a whole bunch of books that are like double stacked on my bookshelf, and I don't know all of the books that I've got in behind the first layer. That's what happens when you run out of space on your bookshelf. Anyhoodle, so it's very interesting because this is kind of its moment, in that the specter of the USSR was something that still sort of hung around for a very long time after it finally crashed and burned. But it's something people aren't concerned about. We're concerned about Russia, yes, but not the USSR. And on that note, I'm going to wrap this up, and yeah, so next week I'll hit the third book in this series, which I don't have in front of me, but it's Unseen Something or Other. So that's everything, and I'll see you all next week.